Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the Gold Silver Bitcoin show brought to you by the GoldSilverBitcoin.com store. We are more than honored to be sitting down with Ed Rankin, who caught my attention on Twitter. He's on fire over there, so go check out Ed's Twitter. Thank you so much, Ed, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Justin.
So before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about numerous topics. We talked about hegemony a little bit, as well as kind of post-World War II U.S. history, which has long been an interest of mine, dating back to, I would say, just the 1945 period and beyond. I can't tell you how many rich educational or scholarly texts there are about what's gone on in United States history since 1945 in particular. You mentioned the CIA, the founding of the CIA. It had been the OSS during World War II. There's this book that I've been meaning to read. I've only read excerpts of it, called The Cultural Cold War, and it discusses the CIA role in arts and letters in the art world in Hollywood, etc. I read another book called Coca Colonization by a teacher who's a professor whose name escapes me right now, out of Austria. But he essentially just discussed the role in which the United States played in order to reshape Europe into a more post-World War II type American society. A lot of post-World War II, a lot of World War II production transferred into what we know now as consumer goods, for instance. He discussed also how in Hollywood during World War II, the directors of films, of propaganda films, would wear actually army uniforms. So they were seen as part of the war effort. In that book, he also discussed how Hollywood would send anti-European films to South America and anti-South American films to Europe. So, what has stood out to you, particularly in the post-World War II era?
Well, I think, Eisenhower's famous farewell address, where he warns the American people about the rise of the military-industrial complex, and in a previous, there's a version edited where he actually brought in medical and other things, but he left those out of that particular speech. And then, Harry Truman presided over the creation of the CIA and the NSA. And later, it was actually after the Kennedy assassination, I think on the first anniversary of Kennedy's assassination, Truman wrote a letter, I believe it was published in the New York Times, where he expressed concern about what was happening with the CIA, and in other places he stated that he regretted actually participating in the formation of the CIA. So, I think, what we've seen is this rise of as Eisenhower warned, the military-industrial complex, and now we're kind of in the midst of a global corporatocracy, the sort of evolution of a global corporatocracy that, a handful of corporations, some say a couple hundred families, and kind of run everything behind the scenes. It's one of the things that I had an interest in, I guess I still do, but was the CIA's involvement in the creation of the term conspiracy theorist as a pejorative in the English language. Because prior to the Kennedy assassination, you really don't see the use of conspiracy theory or conspiracy theorists very much in literature. But a couple of years after Kennedy assassination, you see it appearing in literature and being used as a pejorative term, basically directed at anybody who challenges the government's official story or explanation for things like assassinations and military interventions and things like that. There was actually literally a program where the CIA was engaged in the creation of that term. Following the Warren Commission, which was studied the JFK assassination, when they published their findings, the majority of Americans didn't buy it. They didn't buy the story that Lee Harvey Oswald used an antiquated rifle to fire off several rounds and to successfully, murder the president of the United States. American people didn't buy it, and the intelligence community and the power structure got concerned. So the CIA launched this program to kind of label anybody who challenged those stories as conspiracy theorists, to shut them down. It's been one of the most successful public relations propaganda programs in modern history, I think.
When did you stumble upon this information and start kind of going down this path? So the way I have heard it be explained before is that, to simplify, there's two kind of schools of history, if you will: the planned view of history, in which perhaps cartels or groups of people invest in a certain future world. And then there's a second theory, the coincidental theory of history, in which, I guess perhaps through Darwinian evolution, humanity unfolds in a way. And this latter version is the one in which is taught in schools, in public schools in particular. So when did you kind of like realize that there were these two competing schools, and then start to look at, perhaps, for instance, propaganda, which in the modern times is dated back to Edward Bernays, who wrote books on public relations and propaganda? The Madison Avenue of New York's in the 1920s is kind of the start of a lot
Right,
of this advertising, marketing,
right,
propaganda efforts.
right.
um, when did you start recognizing these kind of actors and the effect they have?
Well, really throughout my life, and I voted when I was first eligible to vote at age 18. And so I cared about politics, and I felt it was my responsibility to participate, to engage. But I didn't really dig behind the surface. I kind of took politicians at their word, and when they make certain statements or took positions on things, I accepted that that's what they where they were, what they really believed. And so I was not really aligned with a particular political party or anything. And because of that, but I sort of watched what happened when certain people were in power. Well, and I guess in many ways, well, I am very libertarian in my political philosophy today. If I'd learned what libertarianism really was all about, which is kind of don't hurt me and don't take my stuff. And we, and adults all our relationships should be voluntary. And if your ideas have to be enforced by government or some power, then perhaps they're not such good ideas after all. But I think for me, it was, I'd kind of voted for George H.W. Bush. I kind of supported that kind of moderate republicanism, that he professed to carry forward. And then, I kind of rode along with Clinton, and I wasn't too distracted with a lot of his personal things, and the economy seemed to be okay, and we seemed to be doing all right. And then George W. Bush took power, and then I started watching the things that started unfolding. And, particularly after 9/11, I had some questions about 9/11. Some things around 9/11 just didn't make sense to me. And then there were a lot of side stories that began to emerge about 9/11, the Pentagon and the alleged, loss of billions, if not trillions of dollars that were in that wing, the records and the people associated with it were in that wing of the Pentagon that was supposedly struck by a plane, the plane that went down in Pennsylvania, where there's nothing left. There were no debris left from the plane that hit the Pentagon. And, just things didn't start to make sense. But at that point, I still was bought into the story, though. And then but then the adventure into Afghanistan and Iraq, then to learn there were really no weapons of mass destruction, that the whole entry into Iraq was all fabricated. And so I started to question things, and then the war kept going on, and 500,000 Iraqis, I think, are believed to have been murdered in that war. And hear Madeleine Albright say, well, that she sort of rationalized the murder of innocent children. And so I really began to detest what happened there. And so Barack Obama came along, and I thought he was an African American guy. Perhaps he could, bring the country together. He was promising hope and change, and he was sort of anti-war rhetoric and all that. So I bought into all that. And about 2 years into his presidency, when things didn't seem to change, and even those promises that he made during the campaign that he could have implemented unilaterally, he failed to do. So I really kind of started digging. And at about that time was when I started working on my doctoral dissertation. And one of the things that interested me is, how could people viewing the same set of information and data, people with similar backgrounds, socioeconomic status, look at all of this and come away with different conclusions. So I dug into that a little bit. And then this whole idea, as I talked about this idea with conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorists, when I learned the CIA had been involved in that, it really just kind of opened things up for me. So I started digging. And then the more, I went into the rabbit hole, the more things I uncovered. And so then I started, and then back to your question, I became familiar with the concept of hegemony, which was, I guess, identified, or it's been mostly identified with Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian communist young man. He's a member of the Italian Communist Party during World War II. He was imprisoned for his beliefs under a fascist Italian government. Although he's a communist, the theory of hegemony has been widely accepted by both conservative and liberal people. But basically, it's an oversimplified explanation is that people in power have power, and they create a society and write the rules that benefit them. And so with enormous amounts of money and wealth, they behind the scenes really control the political process. And what I began to realize is that the red team, which at the time was kind of led by George W. Bush, and the blue team, which was led by Barack Obama, actually were owned by the same people. And so, with that realization, it really kind of opened my mind. And I think once you reach that consciousness about these things, it's kind of, you can't put it back in the can, So
did you vote for Barack Obama?
I actually did. In 2008, I voted for Barack Obama, and I contributed all the money that I possibly could, because I really believed in his rhetoric, and I believed in him, and I thought he was a man who could kind of bring the country back together and hopefully undo a lot of the tragic things that had occurred during the Bush administration. But as we learned, he didn't change very much.
And 2012. I mean, I guess it's getting a little personal, but I'm just curious because
no, in 2012, actually, I didn't vote for him in 2012. I discovered libertarianism, and I voted for Ron Paul.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Ron Paul ran actually in 2008. And if you look, actually, I believe at some of the Google search trends, I did some look at the Google search trends in January of 2016 in the lead up to the Clinton-Trump election, and to see kind of where things stood. And I found very clearly that Bernie Sanders was the most popular Democrat candidate, and that Donald Trump was the most popular Republican candidate. And I also found out that up until very late in the 2012 election, I believe, Ron Paul was well out in front of many of the other candidates, which included Hillary Clinton as well, which I found quite interesting. Now, how reliable is Google Trends? Well, I was not surprised the night Donald Trump got elected president, not by any stretch of the imagination. Everyone with whom I was that night, however, was very surprised and shocked. So yeah, similar to me, certainly wish I had cast a Ron Paul vote in 2008. And I think that a lot of people feel that way as well. So then you discovered libertarianism in 2012. So I want to talk a little bit about that, but just to keep on the theme of presidents, I guess then Donald Trump comes along in 2016. What are your thoughts on that as that unfolds?
Well, initially I didn't like Trump. I didn't, he, in his brashness and his, and some of the things that the media said about him, I sort of bought into it, but some of the stuff. But later on, and I guess at the same time, I kind of started learning things about Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton and some of the things that they had done. I took a harder look at Donald Trump, and I became a big Donald Trump fan. In fact, a lot of my libertarian friends, I know Gary Johnson pretty well. It was Gary Johnson actually voted for in 2012. I supported Ron Paul and wanted Ron Paul to win the GOP nomination, and now watch the GOP steal it from him. And that was that really turned my stomach towards the Republican Party. And then I became in support of Gary Johnson, and I know Gary. And I've had dinner with him a couple of times. Well, I can think he's a great guy. By his own admission, he's not a great political candidate, not a great campaigner, but he's a good guy. I think his heart was in the right place. But it was. I think I supported Trump in 2016, and because pleasantly surprised. I thought he had a good shot at it, but I didn't. By that point, I'd kind of lost my trust in the the voting process, and the honesty, the integrity of the voting process. So I wasn't quite sure he would win. So I was pleasantly surprised when he did win. And I think Trump did a lot of great things as president.
For somebody who was in, I guess, 10th or 11th grade when we invaded Iraq and saw that war only expanded, the question with Trump was, would he continue to expand, at least by the question of opening a new theater? And he did not. And
correct.
through that lens, he's the best president I ever was able to bear witness to.
Yeah.
But not a lot of my peers wouldn't be able to fathom the idea.
Yeah, totally. Well, I've lost a lot of friends, and I have some family members who don't speak to me anymore because of some of the political positions I hold. But I can't I can't not believe what I know to be true. You alluded earlier to modern history, and I think one of the most interesting books is Tragedy and Hope. It was written by Carroll Quigley. I don't know if you remember that book, but he was a professor at Georgetown University. And one of his acceptance speeches, Bill Clinton referred to Carroll Quigley as one of his most important mentors. And it's essentially a modern history. But and that was another thing that book really kind of changed my understanding and thinking about politics and the political world. Because Quigley, I think the text is like 900 pages long, and there's like 150 pages of footnotes. So everything in the book is documented and footnoted. And as you talked about earlier, it chronicles the evolution of the global economy and identifies the power brokers who made it happen. It talks a lot about, even 200 years ago, the collaboration of the media source like the London Times and the New York Times with the powerful elite and the political establishment. And so the media has always been a big part of how they maintain control. And, in the royal families, hundreds of years ago, they were, the King of England and the King of France or Belgium would actually be related. They'd be first cousins or cousins, and they'd start wars to fight one another to keep populations under control. This has been going on forever. And I think basically the same people are running things today that were running things, a couple of hundred years ago. It's interesting to watch what's happening in the UK with, I don't know whether Elizabeth is still alive or not. I think there's some speculation that she might actually be dead by now, but you can obviously, Charles is becoming much more visible. If you notice the speech he made the other day in Scotland, where he talked about he wants to create a military style war against in defense of the environment. It's a war against carbon, which we are actually, a large part of our bodies are made of carbon. So, it's so I think, but just even today, it's interesting. Some of the great colonial powers in Western Europe still have monarchs. So why is that? I've always been curious how the English and the Brits tolerate the monarchy, which is just a bunch of parasites. But actually, who knows how much wealth they control behind the scenes.
What was your dissertation on?
It was about how the CIA created the term conspiracy theorist as a pejorative, and it's as a means of controlling people.
How many pages were you able to get on that topic?
I think it's I've forgotten. I think it's about 100 pages or so. I had a dissertation committee that encouraged brevity. It was about being concise, so it's pretty dense. There's a lot of stuff. Everything's well documented, of course, but they were happy for me to. And I started out with a much broader view of things, and they really. One of the things I learned about this dissertation process and academia in general is that once you become a PhD, you join a group of people, usually a handful of people around the world who care anything at all about your topic. So it's a real deep dive on a real specific area. and you're actually trying to uncover some piece that hadn't been done before. I in correspondence with a professor at Florida State, Lance DeHaven Smith, who authored a great book called Conspiracy Theory in America. And in that book, he alludes to the CIA program. So I corresponded with him, told him about my interest. And he's the one who encouraged me to try to build find the academic support and the evidence. What I've attempted to do in my dissertation is pull together the evidence of how the CIA pulled this off and the evidence that it's still effective today. And I think I did a reasonably good job of doing that.
So can you kind of lay out that dissertation for us? Like, what was the argument, and why is it still working today, I suppose? Can you flesh that out anymore? Alternatively, are there any anecdotes that you recall?
Well, I think it goes back to the concept of hegemony, and then the level of control that the power structure, the global power structure, has over media primarily, and the messaging. And it starts when we're children. There's all sorts of messaging in the media. There's a concept called predictive programming, where a concept will be presented to the public through a movie or through television. They're called programs, right? Through a television series that will throw a concept or an idea out there, and it's sort of seeding the human mind to accept that thing when it appears. And so, there's a lot of evidence that these things are planned decades in advance, and that our tax dollars are essentially being used to control us. And it's done through, there's a lot of very sophisticated things that come out of places like DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Project Administration, funded by our tax dollars. And a lot of these things, or DARPA was created as a response to the Soviet Union, the great evil empire. And so, the public has been convinced to fund these things, or to allow these things to go forward. There's enormous expenditures on defense, for example, because of this need to protect ourselves against these external threats, which the external threats were actually created by the same people who are controlling us. A lot of evidence that Henry Ford's other very powerful people were involved in the creation of the Soviet Union. We actually had, the United States was involved in that whole thing. So Hitler was funded to some degree by American business interests. He kind of went too far, I think. The CIA was involved in the funding of Mao in China, and there's a lot of evidence that we actually put Mao Zedong in place in power in China, and a lot of the Chinese social and political positions were kind of they were posited by us. They were planted by the power structure, not us, but the folks who run our world.
What do you recall of the fall of the Soviet Union, and how has your view of that event changed since it happened to today?
Yeah, it's really good. I don't know. I think that, it's possible that Soviet leaders went off the rails a little too far for, the folks who pulled the strings, the hegemons who run our world. And then, so, but essentially my understanding is that, Ronald Reagan basically spent the Soviets, he outspent the Soviets. They couldn't keep up, and their economy just wasn't able to keep up with our defense spending. And so it was the economics that took the Soviet Union down. And I think early on, some of the Soviet leadership was still under the control of the United States. I don't think Putin is. I think Putin has done a lot. He's really a Russian nationalist. If you look at some of the things he said most recently about what's happening in the United States he's been very critical and actually drawing comparisons between the Soviet Russia and current day American, where political direction is going. And at the end of the day, it's really all about authoritarianism, right? And whether it's Nazi authoritarianism or communist authoritarianism, it's around collectivism and centralized control and people in power wanting to continue to expand their power and grow that power and exercise greater and greater degrees of control. So I think, but I think that was largely, I think during the Trump administration, this whole thing trying to create Russia as the bad guy and associate Trump with Putin. And probably, my sense is there probably were some behind the scenes discussions going on between Trump and Putin that, hey, why can't we just get along, go along to get along kind of stuff. And that's not what the people that, they want tension, they want conflict. There's a ton of money made off of defense contracts. And now pharmaceuticals. I saw today, I can't remember how many $1 billion the pharmaceutical companies have made profit from this recent COVID thing. So there's just the money. The amount of money is just it's hard for the average person to imagine how much wealth has been spent on things like defense and now in pharmaceuticals. And so, but that's where this concentration of power and wealth occurs. And of course, once you have the power and you have the wealth, you don't want to relinquish it, right? You want to continue to expand it.
I think when I think to the Soviet Union, there was this notion that it was the end of communism. But I think an alternative conclusion is that it was really the birth of a third way, which was sort of a marriage between commercial, I don't want to call it capitalism, but, a corporatism and communism.
Yeah, well, I think, I don't know whether it's an accurate attribution or not, but there's been this attribution that Mussolini, the Italian fascist dictator, he called his Italian version of fascism corporatism, which is kind of the marriage of the state with corporations. And that certainly seems like where we are today. Lance DeHaven Smith, that I alluded to earlier, professor at Florida State, who wrote Conspiracy Theory in America, he coined a term called state crimes against democracy as an alternative to conspiracy theory. That's really what's happening, and it's an undemocratic. It's a centralized control, I think. I had a friend of mine asked me the other day, he said, "Do you really believe there was fraud in the 2020 election?" And I said, I can't imagine any thinking person who looks at the evidence could not come to that conclusion. Of course, he doesn't believe there was, but I think that that's where we are now. But the amount of money that's being used, and of course, with the Federal Reserve Bank, there's a printing press there, and basically unlimited amount of dollars can be created to be used to buy up assets, to buy off politicians, and it's not coming out of the pockets. It's actually our taxpayer dollars are being used to fund these things, and it doesn't diminish the wealth of the people who are in charge. They just continue to get more and more wealthy through all this.
Being in charge. So you know what? Maybe that's a good segue, actually. So you do some, I think, executive coaching work, and business is something I'm interested in. I just recently registered as a libertarian in Idaho. However, I don't necessarily apply that term to myself. I would also apply happily classical liberal and have a discussion about what that encompassed 300 years ago, et cetera. However, I did look at that L on the voter registration card, and I was like, I'm going to definitely fill that one out. So then
it's the best choice we have right now, I think.
Mm-hmm. So then, although here also, and although I don't know too much about their platform, you can also register as part of the Constitution Party.
Yeah,
but that's neither here nor there. So I'm curious, I'm interested in entrepreneurship. One of my favorite online personalities is this gentleman named Gary Vaynerchuk, who did vote for Joe Biden. However, he's teaching the world how to be free marketeers, how to be entrepreneurs, and his content is very valuable along those lines. And he dispenses a lot of information about how to be successful in this world, how to communicate well, how to connect with people, how to do what you're passionate about and succeed at it and be yourself and be comfortable with being yourself. About how people, for instance, don't post because they're scared of the ramifications. And that's the number one reason why people don't take part in the online digital conversation taking place,
Yes.
is fear.
Right.
And he says we have to vanish, we have to do away with all that stuff. So I'm curious, like in your work, like what do you find that executives like need to work on most, and how they kind of get control of that?
Um, yeah, it varies some, but at the core of what I do is to really help my clients increase their level of self-awareness, and it's awareness about their strengths, it's awareness about their developmental opportunities, you call them weaknesses, whatever it is, and helping and taking that information and helping them become more effective leaders. I'm a recovering entrepreneur. I had started a little company. It was a one-room executive suite office with no windows. And a year later, we were doing, I think, $500,000 in business. And then when we did it, then third year or second year, we did $1 million. Then we did 2 million. Then we did 4 million. And I realized then I had a real business on my hands. And we took in some investment capital and we got the company to about 7 million and sold it. And we were Inc. 500 in 1999, I think. And then about that same time, we were named the Portfolio Company of the Year by the National Association of Small Business Investment Companies, which is a trade association representing small business investment companies around the country. And so we had some success there. And after sold the business, I had to sit back and think about what was I going to do now. And I had a lot of friends and people that I knew who were thought leaders in the world of human resources management, suggest that I take a look at executive coaching, succession management, leadership development. And I'm delighted that I did. I went back to school, and I didn't feel like I had the academic underpinnings to do it. So I went back and finished some additional education, including the doctorate, so I could prepare myself for it. But I'd say I get the best job in the world. I get to help people, and I get paid pretty well to do it. But I think awareness is a huge thing. Awareness is everything. It really is. And one of the phenomena I've observed is once people become more aware of themselves, they also become more aware of the world outside of themselves. I think they're better able to understand other human beings. I think they're better able to see things in the world and observe things in the world. So much of the work I do is really helping people enhance their level of self-awareness. But from a more practical perspective, most leaders deal with issues of building an effective team, knowing how and when to delegate. Those are big things. And then communication, both downward, sideways, and up. I just had a call this morning with a guy who is the CIO apparent for a pretty decent sized public company. And he's being groomed to take over when the current CIO retires. And a lot of what he needs to work on now really is upward communication. The company went public recently. And so the role of the CIO in a public company, there's more visibility, potential interaction, engagement with industry analysts. The analyst will be looking at the company and observing what it's doing from a technological perspective. So he's a great. His team loves him. His peers like him. He's respected by the leadership. But his next move will be really how to more clearly link the activities of his and to the business objectives and what's happening in the industry. He's not there right now. We spent a whole hour this morning talking about that issue alone. What can he do to become to be more aware of what's going on in the industry and how his company is responding to the things that are going on in the industry, and what is the technology of the company doing to facilitate all of that. It's and he understands it, and we're working on some. We this morning we discussed some specific activities and things he will start doing in order to help improve his he has the ability to think strategically. He's not doing it now. It's not been part of his role previously. His role has been to run the IT function, not worry about external factors that much. He has been supporting his internal constituents. But as CIO of the corporation, he'll need to be better prepared to work externally. He'll be on calls with the CEO and the executive team when they're talking shareholder meetings and calls with analysts. He's probably going to be there. There'll be questions posed to him sometimes about how the company's responding to changes in the industry and the technology to support that. So these are the kinds of things that I find that I work on a lot with people.
I can see how delegating might be helpful in being able to reallocate time towards doing those things that one needs to do to maybe be able to communicate in those ways. So when I am and then another strategy that comes to mind, and this is really kind of just the Gary Vee strategy, is he puts himself out there and he's talking to people all the time. So I'm always talking to executives in particular. They have a great opportunity where they can do a show like I'm doing here, talk to the people in their industry who know the most, bring them on the show. And then you sit down and you have a hour-long education about what you need to know. And then alternatively, you also have a bunch of other functions. So PR, blog, communication. So that's PR. So PR, blog, that's pretty much it. I guess, the third one I always like to do is op-ed. So if you're going to have a podcast and you're talking, you're essentially potentially writing an op-ed that you can shop to a third-party publication as well. But I think most importantly is you're going to make connections with people who know more than you do, and you're going to learn from them. And so I guess delegating is, one way of sort of being able to free up time to do the things you need to do. But then how can you do those things as efficiently as possible? Also is a question. We have so people always talk about how much time can this or that possibly take? And there's all these little things that you have to do throughout the day. And I don't necessarily think of these things in terms of how much time they take, but I do know that we make 35,000 decisions every day, or we can. That's just some number that's thrown out. But this general, let's just say as a thought experiment. You only have X amount of decisions that you can make every single day. So therefore, potentially with every decision you make, you're losing a little bit of decision-making power on that path, during that deterioration until you go to sleep and get a full night's rest. So if I can eliminate decision-making throughout the day, then I can be more primed for the decisions I do need to make. Just some thoughts.
No, that's exactly right. And I think, a lot of that is making sure you've got a team, a good team in place where you feel confident that you can delegate. I've been working with a fellow, he's running a $6 billion division of a global financial services company. And when he and I first started working together, he was new in the role. His boss wasn't quite sure he was the right guy. He had a weak team. He had some problems with regulators. His net promoter scores among his customer base were not good and they were falling. His engagement scores among his employee group were not good and falling. So he had a lot of challenges. And one of the first things he did was really focus on getting the right team in place. He had to ignore some of the other things for a while because he knew the key for him was to get the right folks in place. Over a period of about 6 months to a year, he made some significant changes in his team, brought some good people in. Then he was able to really address the other issues. Now, a year and a half later, his time is spent on much different things. He's thinking about business growth, strategy, product development, other things. But he couldn't have done that until he got these other things fixed. I think a lot of things, one of the things an executive coach does is help their clients set priorities and hold them accountable for for working against those priorities, because executives have so many things they have to deal with, and so there's so much noise. And so how do you shut the noise down, focus on the things that are really going to make the difference, and get those things done? So he's done all of those things, but it's taken a little while. But it's that awareness about needs to be done. What are we faced with, right? What are the big problems, challenges that we've got to address? And then how do we set some priorities to make sure we get those things knocked off in the right order? And so now, he's got a great team around him. He joked with me a few months ago, one day on a call, he said, "I'm bored. I have nothing to do. Everything's working." That's where you wanted to go. So now he's focused on growth, and which is the next phase for the company.
So interesting. And so the communication that comes to mind is, how do you communicate with, you mentioned up, down, sideways, and that's an interesting, the dynamics in the workplace, especially when you're a libertarian amongst non-libertarians. No, I'm kind of joking, kind of not. It does provide some challenges. So like one of the things that, so I guess I want to talk about communication. So he has a team that's in place. He has a team in place. The glue of that was his ability to communicate and put that team in place and make them feel a part of the team and feel invested enough, have confidence in him. Correct? And
Yes.
like what other dynamics? And this comes back to kind of raising one's awareness, which I think, there's this talk about EQ, emotional intelligence.
Yeah,
and this is kind of what Gary Vaynerchuk mentions. And I've heard some pushback, whether founded or not, against that notion. What is being described as EQ is, it might be a facet of IQ, whatever you want to call it. It is certainly very key. I think startups have narcissistic personality disorder, generally speaking. And I wonder what that's a reflection of. They just talk about themselves all the time. So I always am saying when your startup walks into a party, all your startup's going to be doing is talking about itself the whole time. And he's going to leave the party with no friends, just people who are like, want to stay away from that.
I think some of that's functional, because in the early stages, it's all about promotion, right? Especially, if you're looking for external funding, you're trying to communicate that, it's promoting your idea, getting other people. And it's, how do you promote your idea to investors? How do you promote it to potential customers? How do you promote it to people? How do you get people to come work with you when you really don't have a track record? You have no history, so you got to sell them on the idea. But you're right, Justin, it really is. I know back in my entrepreneurial days, I was guilty of that myself. Yeah, that's quite true. Well, I think, messaging, that's one of the things that I'm working with several of my clients right now on, is messaging and how to message. So I'm working with a guy in the hospitality industry. He runs a $1 billion hotel chain. It's one of the brands by one of the global hospitality companies. And you can imagine what they've gone through. I mean, it's a largely franchise operation, and so the owners, that his customers, have been brutalized the last couple of years. So, so much now is his task is, how do you get people out of this survival mode and get them into, because he's saying our numbers now compared to 2019. So we're not thinking about 2020 anymore. We're thinking about 2019. So we're back there now, but still the mood in the organization, they're still kind of entrenched in that survival mode. So for him, it's a lot about messaging. And one of the things we're working on now is storytelling. And that's another arena, but executive storytelling, I think it's big now. It's going to get bigger. And so it's the messaging, being able to communicate, and like parables, not to bring religion into the discussion, but Christ did a wonderful job. I mean, the stories that were told 2,000 years ago still ring true today because of the parables that he told. So it's a similar thing that I think effective executives will be doing now, is how to personalize and connect and message, and through that kind of storytelling that people will remember, that sets a tone. So and like what you said is totally true, right on point with these teams. That my client, we assembled a team. He's got great people in place now. So largely what he's doing now, we got a message about our new strategy, our new products. Where are we going? And how do you do that in a way that people will remember and it has an impact? So it's part of this whole organizing the minds of the people that you're leading and getting them to buy into where you're going, to understand what's going to take to get there, what their role is in that process, and what success looks like. And so I think you're going to see more of that in the coming years. And storytelling is big now, but it's going to be huge in the next 3 years or so.
What is strategy in business? I find that oftentimes the divisions of different, particularly early stage companies, tend to be thinking in terms of like weeks. And so it's like on Monday, there's a bunch of tasks that are on the agenda for that week, and you're going to really run around and try to get them as much done as possible. But then emails are going to come in throughout the course of that week. And then the following week, you're going to have a whole new set of things to do. And it's quite amazing to watch. I think a lot of young startups work. I don't come at business from a business perspective. I come at it from a life perspective. And so that I think, obviously I want to be very successful, but like at the end of the day, these are the hours of our lives. These are how we're spending our lives. So what do we want to be doing? Where are we going? And what will we allow interrupt that path? And so, like for me, a strategy is something that's like at the shortest term would be like a quarterly agenda, if you will. And you set in these pillars in place, and you have to stick to these pillars, and you're going to do them for one, if not 2 quarters. 1 quarter might not be enough time to do it properly. And that's what you're going to do. And you're going to be patient. And there's things that you maybe in the past would have worried about on a day-to-day basis, but now you're just not going to get to them. You're going to really focus on high value initiatives. So like in marketing communications, like for me, this seems like really low hanging fruit. Like every startup in the world should become a news outlet. They just start a show like this. They have their experts on. So the people, their messaging, like the people who know what they want to message about the best, they're going to have them on, and they're going to learn about their industry themselves so they can build out their message through this vehicle. Everything's going to get transcribed. Everything's going to get put out everywhere. You're going to outproduce everybody. You're going to have more attention on your content than your competitors in virtually every single like industry. Let's leave the Fortune 100 and above off this list, and below and above. All the Fortune companies are off this list. But for everyone else, like you cannot saturate the internet. You will never saturate the internet. And there's clear data in the back of these platforms that suggest that the more you put out, the more you'll be seen and you can build a brand. But during that journey specifically, if you're basing it on long form content like this, on the experts who you're going to get your messaging from, and potential business development partners or sales leads, then you can essentially like really simplify the marketing communications to where now all of a sudden your marketing communications people know what they're doing every single day, every single week, every single month, why they're doing it. And there's no new stuff that's coming up. There's no new announcement that comes in on Monday and you need to get out Tuesday. Okay, there's only 2 minutes left. What is strategy?
Well, my favorite book on strategy is the book Blue Ocean Strategy. I don't know if you're familiar with that. But it really, I think, puts forth a real different way of looking at that whole concept. It was interesting. I'm working with a guy who's an EVP candidate for one of the largest consulting firms in the world. And I mentioned the book to him, and he said, interesting, I've never heard of it. And he read the book, and he said, wow, it was really, but it really made an impact. But, there's the red ocean where everybody's has a similar products and services, so they're trying to compete with one another, just do it a little bit better than the other guy. But then there's another place over here where nobody else is at right now, and it's called the blue ocean. And an example of that would be Cirque du Soleil, for example, where they kind of broke the paradigm with the circus. Circus is very popular, but very expensive, right? The animals and the PETA and all that. And it became too expensive to drag elephants around the country and on trains. but people still would pay money to go to the circus. So what they did is they stripped the animals out, brought in acrobats, right? And so they still created, they've got the tent, they've got the 3 rings, it's very reminiscent of circus of old, and extremely profitable. I mean, they took a bunch of ex-Olympic gymnasts and created this wonderful creation called Cirque du Soleil. So that didn't really answer your question, but when I think of strategies, that's what I think about. Where can we go that nobody else is playing?
Aim for the stars and like have fun at it. I think that, wow, it's just like, you got to think real big and you got to think real quick too, to survive out there. And, but stress doesn't necessarily have to be a part of that. So we've had the honor and privilege to speak today with Ed Rankin. I really recommend everyone follow him on Twitter at /Edwin Rankin. Thank you so much, Ed, for joining us today.
Thank you, Justin. It's been my pleasure.
And thank you everyone for listening.